On a fog-choked morning in July 1779, a wealthy British merchant captain stood on the deck of his cargo ship, just 10 miles off the coast of Yorkshire, England. He was carrying thousands of pounds worth of Jamaican sugar, rum, and valuable trade goods bound for London. He was in home waters. The Royal Navy, the most terrifying and powerful fleet on the face of the earth, patrolled these exact channels. He felt completely safe. Then, out of the thick grey mist, a sleek, black-hulled schooner appeared. It carried no royal flag. It flew a red and white striped banner that most British sailors had never seen before. Before the merchant captain could even scream an order to his crew, gun ports slammed open along the side of the strange vessel. A volley of cannon fire tore through his rigging, shattering the mainmast and dropping heavy canvas onto the deck in a tangled heap. Within minutes, armed men scrambled over the wooden railings with cutlasses between their teeth and loaded flintlock pistols in their hands. They were not wearing official Navy uniforms. They wore ragged linen shirts, canvas trousers, and leather caps. They were American privateers. In less than 20 minutes, without a single British warship in sight, the privateers took control of the vessel, turned its wheel toward a safe port, and sailed away with one of the richest cargoes in the British Empire. Events like this were happening every single week, right off the shores of Great Britain. The year was 1779, and the mighty British Navy was losing control of its own backyard. But how did a group of American fishermen, merchants, and legalized pirates manage to terrorize the most powerful empire on Earth on the high seas? To understand how these armed civilian boats ended up terrorizing British home waters in 1779, you have to look at the brutal mathematical reality George Washington faced at the start of the war. In 1775, the British Empire possessed over 270 fully armed warships. They had massive ships of the line carrying up to 100 heavy cannons each, manned by professional sailors who had been drilling on the high seas for decades. The Royal Navy controlled every major trade route on the Atlantic Ocean, blocked American harbors, and stopped vital supplies from reaching the rebellious colonies. The American colonies, on the other hand, had 0 warships. They had no formal naval tradition, no shipyards built for heavy military frigates, and no war chest to buy expensive naval cannons. The Continental Congress did try to build a small navy, but it was an absolute disaster from the start. Out of the 13 frigates Congress ordered to be built in 1775, only a handful ever made it to open water. Most were burned in harbor to prevent them from falling into British hands, and the few that did sail were quickly hunted down, sunk, or captured by superior British squadrons. Meanwhile, George Washington's Continental Army was starving on land. His men were marching through frozen mud without shoes, short on uniforms, and most dangerously, completely out of gunpowder. In the winter of 1775, Washington wrote that his troops had barely enough powder to fire 9 rounds per man if the British attacked. If America tried to fight a standard naval war against Great Britain, the revolution would be crushed in a matter of months. They could not match the Royal Navy in open battle. They needed another way to strike back, a strategy that did not cost the government a single penny, but could hit the British Empire where it hurt the most, its wallet. This was the moment George Washington and the Continental Congress turned to one of the oldest, dirtiest tactics in maritime history: legalized piracy. Congress began issuing official legal documents, called letters of marque. A letter of marque gave a private shipowner the legal right to arm his vessel, sail out onto the high seas, and attack any British merchant ship he could find. If the privateer captured a British ship, they did not hand the cargo over to the government. They brought the captured vessel into a safe port, sold the ship and its entire cargo at public auction, and divided the cash directly among the investors, the captain, and the crew. This was not charity. This was purely driven by greed, and it worked like magic. Overnight, wealthy merchants in Boston, Salem, and Philadelphia stopped trading cod and timber and started converting their fast-sailing cargo ships into deadly hunting vessels. They mounted light iron cannons along the decks, cut extra gun ports into the wooden hulls, and packed the decks with dozens of hungry, tough sailors looking to make a fortune. A single lucky cruise could turn a poor deckhand into a rich man overnight. A regular sailor in Washington's army earned barely $6 a month, if Congress even had the money to pay him. But a single privateer crew member could walk away with hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars in gold after capturing just one sugar ship from the West Indies. This financial incentive unleashed a wave of sea guerrillas across the Atlantic. Salem fishermen, cod catchers, and tough harbor workers transformed into predatory sea hunters. They were not fighting for military glory or army promotions. They were fighting for cash, survival, and independence. By 1778, hundreds of these armed privateers were swarming the Atlantic trade routes, waiting like wolves along the ocean paths used by the British merchant fleet. By 1779, this privateering war exploded into a full-blown financial catastrophe for the British Empire. Over 500 privateer vessels were actively hunting across the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and right off the rocky coastlines of England, Scotland, and Ireland. These privateers were not heavy warships built to stand in a line of battle and trade heavy broadsides with British frigates. They were lightweight, fast-sailing schooners and brigantines designed for extreme speed. They carried tall masts and enormous canvas sails that allowed them to outrun almost any heavy Royal Navy warship sent to catch them. Their tactics were ruthless, fast, and remarkably effective. Privateers worked in small, loose packs or as lone hunters, hiding in foggy sea lanes, behind coastal islands, or along major trade corridors. When an isolated British merchant vessel carrying sugar, indigo, cotton, or military stores appeared on the horizon, the privateer would use its superior speed to close the distance quickly. Before the British crew could maneuver their heavy, overloaded cargo ship, the privateer would sweep alongside, rake the deck with grapeshot, and drop boarding bridges onto the wooden rails. Dozens of armed privateers would swarm the deck with cutlasses, pike poles, and pistols, forcing the British captain to strike his colours within minutes. The material rewards streaming back into North America were staggering. Millions of dollars worth of captured British goods poured into ports like Marblehead, Boston, and Philadelphia. Entire shipments of British Army wool coats, leather boots, muskets, and tons of black gunpowder, intended for Lord Cornwallis's troops in the colonies, were seized on the open ocean and delivered directly into the hands of Washington's starving Continental Army. In fact, without captured British gunpowder supplied by privateers, Washington's artillery guns would have gone silent for months at a time. The privateers were not just enriching themselves, they were physically feeding, arming, and fueling the American Revolution on land using captured British supplies. While privateer captains were growing rich off captured sugar and gunpowder, the financial heart of the British Empire was sinking into absolute chaos. In London, the famous insurance market, Lloyd's of London, became the centre of a brewing economic panic. Before the privateer crisis hit its peak in 1779, insuring a merchant ship sailing across the Atlantic cost British traders a modest 3 to 5% of the cargo's value. But as hundreds of British ships vanished into thin air on the high seas, Lloyd's underwriters realized they were losing fortunes. Insurance rates skyrocketed to 40, 50, and in some high-risk sea lanes, over 60% of a vessel's total value. For many small merchant houses in London, Bristol, and Liverpool, shipping goods across the ocean became completely unaffordable. Ships sat rotting at British docks because owners could not afford the insurance required to put them out to sea. In the British Parliament, furious debates broke out night after night. Angry merchants slammed their fists on tables, demanding to know why the royal government was spending millions of pounds on the Navy while humble American privateers were plundering merchant fleets right in the English Channel. Over 1,500 British merchant ships were captured or destroyed by American privateers over the course of the war, resulting in millions of pounds sterling in direct losses to the British economy. British newspapers mocked the Admiralty, asking how an empire that claimed to rule the waves could fail to protect its own coastline from rebel fishermen. The psychological impact was far worse than the financial damage. For the first time in over a century, everyday British citizens living in coastal towns felt vulnerable to attack right outside their front doors. If you are learning something new about how this secret naval war actually played out, take a quick second to hit the subscribe button right now. We break down the world's most intense, forgotten historical strategies every week, and you won't want to miss the wild turning points coming up next. Then came April 1778, setting the stage for the total breakdown of British security in 1779. A Scottish-born captain named John Paul Jones took this sea war to a level no British citizen thought possible. Commanding a small 18-gun sloop of war named the Ranger, Jones sailed straight into the Irish Sea. He did not just want to capture merchant ships in open water. He wanted to bring the terror of war directly onto British soil. On the night of April 22, Jones rowed 2 small wooden boats into the harbour of Whitehaven, England, a busy port town packed with hundreds of British merchant vessels anchored side by side. Under cover of pitch darkness, Jones and a small landing party of 30 men slipped past the harbour guards, climbed over the stone battery walls, and spiked the town's defensive cannons by hammering iron spikes into their touch holes. They then set fire to a large coal vessel anchored in the harbour, hoping the flames would spread across the entire crowded dockyard. The raid itself caused only minor physical damage, but the psychological shockwave shattered British confidence overnight. An enemy raiding party had stepped onto English soil, disarmed a British port, and set fire to ships right in front of the townspeople without losing a single man. Terrified coastal towns across England and Ireland began building makeshift shore batteries, organising local volunteer militias, and begging the Admiralty for naval protection. British citizens along the coast stopped sleeping peacefully, convinced that American privateers and commerce raiders were lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for nightfall to burn their towns to the ground. By early 1779, the British government was no longer just fighting a rebellion thousands of miles away in North America. They were fighting to maintain basic law, order, and control along their own home shores. All of this ocean chaos came to a dramatic head on the night of September 23, 1779, off the coast of Yorkshire at the Battle of Flamborough Head. Captain John Paul Jones was now commanding an old, decaying French East Indiaman converted into a 40-gun warship, renamed the Bonhomme Richard. Sailing off the English coast, Jones spotted a massive convoy of 41 British Baltic merchant ships, escorted by 2 British warships. The brand-new 44-gun frigate HMS Serapis under Captain Richard Pearson, and a smaller armed vessel, the Countess of Scarborough. Jones immediately steered the rotting Bonhomme Richard straight toward the superior British frigate. What followed was one of the most brutal, bloody, and horrific single-ship actions in naval history. As the 2 warships closed, a heavy exchange of cannon fire erupted in the fading twilight. Early in the battle, 2 of Jones's heavy 18-pounder cannons exploded on the lower deck, killing their crews and blowing open the side of his own ship. The Bonhomme Richard was taking on water fast. Fires were spreading through the wooden hold, and dozens of crew members lay dead or dying on the bloody wooden planks. Captain Pearson of the Serapis saw the American ship burning and sinking. He called out across the water through the gun smoke, asking if Jones was ready to surrender his colors. Jones, standing on a deck covered in blood, splinters, and body parts, roared back his legendary reply, "I have not yet begun to fight." Knowing his ship would sink if he stayed at range, Jones deliberately rammed the Bonhomme Richard into the side of the Serapis. His crew lashed the 2 warships tightly together with heavy ropes, locking them in a deadly wooden embrace. For over 2 hours, the ships sat side by side, at point-blank range, firing cannons directly into each other's hulls. American sharpshooters, including French Marines and privateer sailors stationed high up in the rigging, poured lethal musket fire down onto the open deck of the Serapis. A privateer sailor crawled out onto a yardarm extending over the British deck and dropped a hand grenade directly down an open hatch. The grenade exploded in a pile of loose gunpowder cartridges, causing a massive chain reaction explosion that blew apart the lower deck of the Serapis. At 10:30 p.m., with his ship shattered, dozens of his crew dead, and the deck behind him a burning graveyard, Captain Pearson finally struck his colors and surrendered. The Bonhomme Richard was so badly damaged that it sank 36 hours later, but John Paul Jones sailed into history aboard the captured HMS Serapis. The Royal Navy had been defeated in a duel right off its own coastline, sending shockwaves through the heart of the British Empire. The surrender of the HMS Serapis off Flamborough Head was far more than just a shocking tactical defeat for the British Navy. It was the strategic turning point of the entire naval war. Up until 1779, the British Admiralty had used its vast fleet to maintain a tight blockade on American ports, cutting off colonial trade and preventing weapons, clothing, and food from reaching George Washington's army. But the relentless privateer raids and high-profile attacks in British waters forced a catastrophic shift in British naval strategy. Under massive pressure from terrified merchants and angry politicians in London, the Royal Navy had to pull dozens of heavy warships away from the American coastline and reassign them to escort duty. Instead of hunting rebel ships or blockading American harbors, British frigates were forced to spend thousands of hours slowly guiding merchant convoys back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, trying to protect sugar and tea from predatory privateers. This redeployment created massive gaps in the British blockade along the North American coast. American supply ships slipped through the newly opened sea lanes, delivering thousands of tons of ammunition, uniforms, and medicine directly into American ports. Even more importantly, it left the American coast vulnerable to foreign naval intervention. When France and Spain officially entered the war as American allies, the diluted Royal Navy could no longer maintain total control of the Atlantic. In October 1781, when Lord Cornwallis found himself trapped on a narrow peninsula at Yorktown, Virginia, he looked out at the ocean, desperately expecting the Royal Navy to sail in, defeat the enemy, and rescue his surrounded army. Instead, he saw 28 French warships commanded by Admiral de Grasse, holding the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in an iron grip. The Royal Navy Relief Fleet, sent from New York, was turned back at the Battle of the Capes because they simply did not have enough available warships to break through. Cornwallis had no escape route left by land or by sea. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army to George Washington. The war was effectively over, and the domino chain that led to Yorktown started with the relentless privateer fleet that forced the Royal Navy to abandon its blockade 2 years earlier. Today, the quiet blue waters of the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean show no remaining physical traces of the terrifying sea war that raged across their waves in 1779. There are no wooden wreckage sites or floating debris left to mark where hundreds of British merchant vessels were boarded, captured, or burned to the waterline. The story of the American privateers is often reduced to a minor footnote in school textbooks, buried underneath the famous land battles of Saratoga, Trenton, and Yorktown. But military historians and naval war colleges around the world still study the privateering campaign of 1779 as one of the most successful examples of asymmetric commerce warfare in human history. Without a formal battle fleet, without heavy naval cannons, and without a government military budget, a loose collection of civilian sailors, Salem fishermen, and legalized pirates took on the greatest maritime empire the world had ever seen. They did not try to defeat the Royal Navy in a traditional line of battle. Instead, they attacked the empire's financial engine, drained its economic resources, and forced the British military to stretch its global fleet to the absolute breaking point. They proved that an army in the field cannot win a war if its supply ships are burning at sea. They proved that ordinary citizens fighting for profit, survival, and independence could outmaneuver professional military forces on the open ocean. And most importantly, they brought the reality of war straight to Britain's front door, proving that even the most powerful empire on earth was not invincible on the high seas. If you enjoyed this deep breakdown of history's wild naval strategy, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment below telling us which forgotten turning point in history we should cover next. We have plenty more stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one.